Chapter 10, Mishnah 4. Having described how barley was harvested for the Omer, the Mishnah discusses its process further. They would harvest the barley and put it into baskets. Then they would bring it into the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash and toast the barley over the fire, while the kernels of barley were still attached to the stalks, in order to fulfill the commandment of the Torah requiring toasting. Although normally, when processing grain, the ears are first threshed, i.e. beaten with a pole, to separate the kernels from the stalks. Here the grains were first toasted, for if the kernels would first be removed from the stalks, it would be impossible to toast them directly over a fire, since the person holding them would get burned. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. But the sages say, before toasting the barley, they would beat it with soft reeds and cabbage stems to remove the kernels from the stalks. Soft reeds and cabbage stems, rather than hard sticks, were used so that the soft barley kernels would not be crushed by the beating. Once the kernels were separated from the stalks, they would put the kernels into a copper pipe designated for toasting grain. The pipe was perforated like a sieve, so that the heat of the fire would penetrate it entirely. After the barley was toasted, they would spread it out in the courtyard, and the wind would blow on it and dry it out. The Mishnah describes how the dry toasted kernels were ground into flour. They would then put the kernels of barley in a bean mill, which grinds coarsely, so that the bran mixed in the grain should not be ground well. Thus, the bran will not pass through the sieve and will be removed when the flour is sifted. Next, the Mishnah states how much flour was actually used for the Omer, and the status of the leftover flour. From the grain, they drew out an isaron of fine flour, which had been sifted with 13 sieves, to be used for the Omer offering. The rest of the flour was redeemed from hekdesh and could then be eaten by anyone. The leftover flour is subject to the obligation of challah. Dough of hekdesh is not subject to challah. Nevertheless, this grain is subject to challah, since it was redeemed before being formed into dough. But it is exempt from maseros, tithes, because the tithing requirement take effect when the piled grain has been smoothed, at which time the grain was still owned by the Beis Hamikdash. However, Rabbi Akiva rules that it is subject to both chalas and masros. The Mishnah describes how the isaron of flour was prepared for offering. On the 16th of Nisan, he, i.e. the one preparing the Omer, would approach the isaron of flour that was to be offered. He would put its oil and levona into an empty klicheres and add the flour. Then he would pour more oil onto the flour and mix the flour and oil, as is done with other menachos. The Kohen would then wave the mixture and bring it near the Mizbeach. Then he would perform kamitza on the flour and oil and burn the kometz and levona on the Mizbeach. The remainder of the Omer was eaten by the Kohanim in the courtyard.